Fair use. Fair use.
The Kimberley coast is a wild and inhospitable place with the largest tides in the southern hemisphere. Over time and with the forces of nature, a wonder world has been created unlike any other. But the most intriguing and mysterious place in this lonely part of the planet is Australia's largest inshore reef system, Montgomery Reef. The reef is a product of the Kimberley's huge tidal differentials. Twice a day as the tide goes out, Montgomery Reef emerges from the sea. As the immense tides drain the reef, waterfalls cascade into deep channels, leaving sinkholes full with whatever creatures missed the chance to escape as the tide ripped out. The landmass of Montgomery varies from around 20 square kilometres at high tide to 300 square kilometres at low tide. The reef is inhabited by an abundance of wildlife. On the eastern edge of Montgomery Reef are little specks of land known as high cliffy islands. Only 1 kilometre long and barely 300 metres wide, High Cliffy may seem relatively insignificant, but for over 100 years they've been a source of intrigue and mystery. High Cliffy was once home to the Yawajabaya people, who lived here for almost 7,000 years. By the turn of last century, they had gained notoriety by passing vessels and explorers as a physically superior race of tribal aboriginals and the giants of the north. They had adapted to their environment superbly. They were big and strong, some as tall as 7 feet. Their lives were intertwined with the massive tides, cyclones, intruders, and the daily pursuit of food. Soon after this film was taken in 1929, the Yawajabaya people vanished, and their disappearance sparked one of the Northwest's greatest mysteries. What brought about their demise, and how could an entire tribe of over 300 people just disappear? Stories of a huge tidal wave, or great wars with neighbouring tribes, or visits from unfriendly aliens abound. Sue O'Connor is an archaeologist at the Australian National University in Canberra. Several years ago, Sue conducted an archaeological dig on High Cliffy.
I originally went to High Cliffy Island, or became interested in it as an archaeologist, because the literature suggested that Aboriginal people would only use big islands close to the mainland, and here you had people using these tiny little offshore islands and catching the tides essentially in an area with the biggest tides in Australia, out to these very small distant islands on these mangrove rafts. So I thought, well, that seems like a really interesting area to investigate, and went up there to do my research work. It was very clear that when you looked at the archaeology, all the archaeology suggested that people were living on fish, shellfish, dugong. They were essentially living on the resources of this reef, and I thought, this is amazing, because it's such a small island. High Cliffy's only a speck of land in the middle, but it's in the middle of the biggest offshore reef. So they're essentially sitting on a natural fish trap. So even though the land is depauperate and doesn't have very much in the way of resources, the ocean is what people are exploiting. So that was the interesting thing archaeologically. It was a very different pattern to the way in which we had previously thought that Aboriginal people used offshore islands.
Over the years, there has been intense speculation as to the origins and purpose of these circular stone rings in the middle of the island. Some say they were created by shipwrecked West Africans. Others say they were used in the processing of beach timor or sea cucumbers by Asian fishermen. Some say they were created by shipwrecked West Africans. Others say they were created by rings in the middle of the island. Some say they were created by shipwrecked West Africans. Others say they were used in the processing of beach timor or sea cucumbers by Asian fishermen.
One of the explanations given to me by one of the elders from Bali elders, the stone structures, he said, the circular house structures, were to hide the fires of the High Cliffy Islanders from the people on the mainland, so that when at night they came in their boats to try and steal the High Cliffy Islanders women, they wouldn't be able to see their fires. But I think the real story of these people eking out a living really by being mobile fishermen, moving between these tiny, tiny lumps of rock on this huge inshore reef, is just as fascinating, if not more fascinating a story than the romantic Portuguese shipwreck one.
Today, the islands have been classified a marine park and attract the occasional visitor. But the mystery remains. What really did happen to the people of High Cliffy Island?
The way you see an idea in your mind.
Fair use.
G'day buddies, I am Jacaro Toro, and on this channel I focus on Australian Aborigines, their languages, cultures, history, and so on. And this is another video in the Australia BB series, so Australia before the British. And in an earlier video I talked about known early European visits to Australia and early European explorations of the Australian coasts. So today I thought I'd ask the question, what of the lingering idea that the Portuguese in pre-colonial times came down from Timor to the Tiwi Islands, located right off the coast here, in order to take slaves. Well, the Tiwi Islands, first of all, consist of two big islands, populated islands, Melville Island and this one, which could possibly be Bathurst, I'm not sure. Two populated islands and a number of smaller unpopulated islands here in this area. There are around 2,000 Tiwis living there, and they speak the Tiwi language. One of the Australian Aboriginal languages that stands a chance of surviving into the future. Most Australian Aboriginal languages find themselves in dire straits these days. Anyway, the Portuguese discovered Timor, and it became very popular among the Portuguese already in the early 1500s because of the abundance of sandalwood they had there. So, where does this idea come from? That the Portuguese went down to the Tiwi Islands to take slaves. They certainly were involved in slave-taking raids early on in the 15 and 1600s. Later on, they bought slaves, prisoners of war. But anyway, it turns out that this idea comes from John Campbell, who was the commandant of Fort Dundas, the first British attempt at establishing a colony in northern Australia, a settlement in the first half of the 1800s. So Fort Dundas was established on Melville Island in 1824. It was abandoned in 1829, and then people moved over to Fort Wellington, which was also abandoned, for Port Essington. So the idea comes from John Campbell, but it has been perpetuated by one George Windsor Earl, who was a linguist and a draftsman, whatever a draftsman is, I wouldn't know. He was a linguist and a draftsman in Port Essington. He wrote a book in 1853 where he devotes one chapter to Melville Island. And actually, George Windsor Earl never visited Melville Island. He bases this chapter on the report by John Campbell. But anyway, perhaps we should start here with known visits to the Tiwi Islands. Then, first of all, we have Peter Peterson, who sailed along the coast. Commander Peter Peterson with two Dutch ships in 1636, so along the coast of Melville Island. He thought, or he didn't realize that it was an island he was looking at. He thought it was part of the mainland, so he named it Van Diemen's Land. So land, land. And Van Diemen after the leader of the Dutch East India Company up north in Indonesia. He didn't go ashore, or anyone on his ships either. However, in 1705, Martin van Delft came with 3 Dutch ships to explore the northern Australian coastline. And actually, they, for most of the time in the region, 3 months, they ended up staying on Melville Island, fraternizing with the locals, as it so happens. So they were there for 3 months. And then we know of no other visit to the Tiwi Islands before Philip Parker King came there with the ship the Mermaid in 1818. And to simplify a little bit what happened, Philip Parker King went ashore on Melville Island with some men of his. When they wanted to go ashore a second time, they were met by Tiwi men with spears. And so they stayed in the boat trying to negotiate with them. And as they were in the process of negotiating, a Tiwi woman came up and said the following thing according to King. This is what he wrote in his report later. She said, "Venaka." Of course, it is impossible to know what she actually said. Philip Parker King wasn't a linguist, a thing that pretty much didn't exist in 1818. So we don't know what the Tiwi woman said, but he interpreted it as "Venaka," which is "come here," in both Portuguese and Spanish. And this fact seems to have been the most important fact for John Campbell when he came up with his idea that Portuguese slave takers came down to the Tiwi Islands. So he read about this. He read Philip Parker King's report, and he took it as a fact that this was indeed what the Tiwi woman had said. So, other things on which he bases his theory that Portuguese slavers came down are the following. At one point, he tried to communicate with the Tiwi man. The Tiwi man brought his wrists together and appeared as if struggling to escape the grasp of an enemy. Then he, the Tiwi man, looked up at a tree and shook his head significantly, which Campbell took to be an allusion to being hung. Why he would take that as an allusion to being hung is unclear, but anyway, that's what he did, and he took that in turn to mean that slavers had been on the islands to take captives, and that they had hung some of their captives. And he took that in turn to mean that slavers had been on the islands to take captives, and that they had hung some of their captives. It is also unclear why slavers would hang people they had taken captive, if indeed they felt that they needed slaves. So you see, we are on very loose ground here, so to speak. And also, another thing that was important for Campbell, he relates how a lad, as he calls him, was taken and detained at Fort Dundas in 1825. Detained for a few days before he escaped. This lad had Malay features and coloring, and according to Campbell, this lad then must have been a Malay lad that had been taken captive from a slave ship and then raised by the local Tiwis. But then it is of course unclear why the Tiwis would take captives from slave ships if they were also afraid of slavers. afraid of being hung. So this does not make sense. This lad, he might well have been the son of a local Tiwi woman and a Makassar Indonesian man. This was quite frequent, that Makassar men had children along the northern Australian coast, so it could well have happened on the Tiwi Islands as well. There is evidence, physical evidence, on the Tiwi Islands that Macassans had been there. However, not necessarily any evidence at all that they had taken slaves, or that the Portuguese had been down there to take slaves. So most important for Campbell when he formulated this theory was this then. And he wrote about this in an article in the Journal of the Royal Geographical Society of London, an article with a really long name. Articles and books in that era tended to have really long titles. So this article was called Geographical Memoir of Melville Island and Port Essington on the Cobourg Peninsula, Northern Australia, with some observations on the settlements which have been established on the north coast of New Holland. So, this idea is perpetuated still in many publications in this century, but as you have probably realized by now, there is pretty much no foundation whatsoever for it. It's an idea that John Campbell came up with, and based on this, written down by a non-linguist who might not have heard correctly what the Tiwi woman said, who possibly wasn't even listening to the Tiwi woman. Perhaps he was mainly focused on the Tiwi men, the armed men, standing on the shore. So really there is no base for this idea. This will be all for today, but rest assured that I will be back. So, see you later.